Do you run a boarding house too?
Do I run a boarding house?
Emily ran a boarding house when she couldn't sell her art.
So no, it's not a boarding house, no. No. But I do take in, I work for the Humane Society, so I suppose I'm taking in all stray animals. You know, I could eventually.
I have a hard time selling my work, so I'm thinking of starting a boarding house too. There's a spider hanging
I know, I've been watching it.
I do have a book she wrote called Clewick, which talks about her time as a teenager, especially when she would get somebody to take her to the tribal villages that were abandoned, and then she would sketch and paint.
You've basically made your way in the world as a musician, right?
Yeah, but I had other jobs.
Yeah, you have.
Well, you know, you go broke,
Yeah.
and then you work for somebody else, then you don't like working for them, and you have voices that tell you, oh, you could really do this. And so you quit the job and go do music, and then you go broke, and then you get another job.
But Emily Carr seemed like she was just driven to capture first the totems and then the scenery, and she'd do anything to improve her capture of that particular element, you know.
Well, as far as narrowing down things, if you're represented by a publisher or something, they want one style because they need to know that you didn't have a happy accident and happened to get this one piece right. So.
Well, and Emily bounced back and forth between watercolor and oil, right? I think she continued.
Started in watercolor.
Exhibit, was it in Toronto? It was the group of 7. And that was the first time that she felt really affirmed, and that really made a difference for her when she got back home. It seems that her dark and moody pieces really came about more at that time.
One of her teachers in France, she said that was pretty good for a woman artist, and she just resented the hell out of that. There were women, I'm trying to think of locally, Eve Slinker was, but Eve Slinker had an inheritance, so she could afford to be an artist. That's another thing that Emily Carr had.
Mm-hmm.
That's a handy thing to have.
I realized that she was an extreme naturalist. I found like not only was her struggle being a woman at that time, or maybe even being a woman at this time, a lot of people don't have that naturalist vision or experience, and all of the things that she did, it was just so far beyond their experience or knowledge or understanding. It was foreign to them.
Yeah.
Emily kind of focused on one tree a lot. Like I feel like I remember seeing like a similar trunk all throughout her paintings, and I was like, oh, I bet she has like a few favorites. She doesn't, like when she paints a tree, it doesn't look like it's just a tree. It looks like forest, like it's.
So I have some not great art, but what was interesting, and then he taught a workshop. What he did is take an object and paint it for 6 months. And he took those big jugs,
Those big.
and he painted them for 6 months. And every nuance, every piece of that, he painted it every kind of color and light and whatever. And then he broke the jug and painted the pieces, you know. I think it was technique which drove him. The other thing is that focusing on external, like the natural world, as soon as you said that, it reminded me of Scott Momaday. And Scott Momaday is the Indian artist and writer, known as a writer. He's a hell of an artist too. And what Momaday is trying to do is portray the world of the Kiowa people in words and stories and mythology and image. And it's all focused on the Kiowa culture. So that's his focus. The driving force for him was the subject matter, and is the subject matter. So Heidi, how does this apply to music?
There's a compelling story. I try to cook it down into a song. I mean, these stories, you know, you read a biography or something.
Yeah.
How to get it into less than 5 minutes.
Well, in art school, we were supposed to keep a sketchbook, and I got a D on my sketchbook. It was like, you know, for an idea, like you're supposed to kind of pitch it to the teacher before you make it. And I'm like, can I just start making it? Like, I just show me the hammers and the saws and the tools and like let me at it.
Technique, because the technique, no matter how rigorous it is, usually follows through from a really tense relationship between yourself and the subject.
I had my favorite professor in philosophy in college said that he would often just get up in the morning and write like T.S. Eliot, or write like, and try to write in the mood of somebody else. Okay, there was a writer in Walla Walla. He wrote potboiler westerns, and he wrote a big book about the Snake River and a big book about Chief Joseph. But mostly he wrote potboiler western. He asked me one time, what is it with this Louis L'Amour? He said, why is he making all this money and stuff? This fella, and I'll remember his name in a minute, had actually sold a couple of books to the movies, and John Wayne had been in Bend in the River. I was talking to a publisher friend, Mark Jaffe, about it, and he said, well, I'll tell you why. First of all, he said Louis L'Amour had a name. What better kind of name could you have than L'Amour to write westerns, huh? And he said, and the second thing was Louis L'Amour wanted to be a millionaire. And I made him one. And I said, how was that? And he was president of Bantam Books at the time. And he said, Louis L'Amour came in and told me he wanted to be a millionaire. And I said, I'll make you a millionaire, Louis. I want 20 books in 10 years. So he did it. And so he said, meanwhile, here's this guy in Walla Walla, and all he wants to do is be Louis L'Amour. I think that I've read, I mean, it's a fictionalized account of her life, okay?
Yeah, why would somebody do that?
That's what that woman does, and she's 6 out. She wrote that, what's the other one? Hyacinth Bloom.
Right.
And, you know, that's another way you can make a living. You could take your songwriting and go write jingles for Nike or something. And, you know, there are people who do that. Well, I think that, I mean, it's like her being a contemporary of Georgia O'Keeffe, her going to Paris, you learn something about art movements and stuff, and intense interest in color struck me, and everything is, all the descriptions are very florid in terms of the descriptions of color.
For her to be that age too and not have had a relationship or marriage, I mean, that's
Right,
probably
which I
common
think is
where...
the point of why she wrote it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I am being a little bit.
Yeah, on the other hand, you know,
Critical.
the fact that here are these, how many sisters, and only one of them marries and has kids, and we don't hear about that, but the fact that that kind of thing was around, happened, is of interest. It was probably easier for a man to, my Uncle Ole never married, and he just was a logger who went here and there, and everybody said, that's old crazy Ole, you know. And that was harder for a woman. Chuck Sams, who's Umatilla, is the head of our National Park Service now. And there's an interview this week in High Country News. And you could say, okay, all of our, the questioner kind of says, well, yeah, all these lands were stolen from Indians. And he said, yeah. He said, but he doesn't get angry about it. He says, we at the Park Service are now entering into co-management agreements with 90 different tribes. One of my favorite stories about that is Mary Schlick wrote a book on Columbia Plateau basketry. And she was the wife in the 50s of a forester who was assigned to the Colville Reservation. And they spent their whole life, and then they went to Warm Springs and they raised their kids there. And she became an expert on baskets. And she became an expert basket maker. And I was talking to the expert basket maker at Umatilla, Joey Lavador, one time, and I said, when did you guys start using corn husks? Because, you know, and corn husks weren't here in the Northwest. He said, well, we started, I think, about 1790. And I said, 1790? There weren't any white people here then? He said, Mary Schlick took us to museums and dated things. And there were plateau baskets with corn husks in 1790. Well, I thank you all very much. And it's a stimulating conversation for me, and I hope it was for some of you. And I look forward to seeing your pottery and to seeing more prints from Heidi. and looking at Coley's sketchbook.
Sticks
Yeah.
The sticks around.
You can critique my sketchbook.